Hello everyone, welcome to Earth Archives. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, comment, share, and don't forget to hit the notification bell. Thank you. Today's topic is Venezuela, from wealth to poverty. Once the wealthiest country in South America, Venezuela's economy collapsed due to US sanctions in 2006, a sharp drop in oil prices in 2013, poor economic management, and corruption. Today, it is one of the countries with the highest inflation rates in the world. In 2023, Venezuela's inflation rate skyrocketed by 193%, while the rate for 2022 was 186%. As early as 2017, Venezuela's inflation had spiraled out of control, increasing more than 4 times compared to the previous year. After the economic collapse, inflation rates could only be estimated, and external sources estimate that from 2019 to 2021, the country's inflation rate was in the 4-digit range. Venezuela's hyperinflation is largely attributed to the government's excessive printing of money, administrative incompetence, and poor management by private enterprises. During the 1970s, the inflation rate was in the single digits, and the economy was growing rapidly. Venezuelans at that time didn't truly understand what inflation was. By the 1990s, with government corruption and the disintegration of democratic institutions, the economy began to decline. In 1996, a severe financial crisis hit the private banking sector, leading to an average monthly inflation rate of over 100%. The people began to endure the era of skyrocketing prices. In 2006, US sanctions were imposed on Venezuela, further exacerbating economic difficulties and creating a humanitarian disaster. Let's look at this country's history and try to understand why a nation rich in natural resources fell into poverty. In 1922, a geologist from the Dutch Royal Shell Company discovered oil at the La Rosa oil field in the Maracaibo Basin, with an output of 100,000 barrels per day, a stunning figure at the time. Within a few years, with the support of the dictator General Juan Vicente Gómez, 1908 to 1935, more than 100 foreign companies began oil production. In the 1920s, production surged from just over 1 million barrels to 137 million barrels annually. By 1929, Venezuela's total production was second only to the United States. By the time Gómez passed away in 1935, Dutch influence had already spread across the country. The value of the Venezuelan bolivar had inflated continuously, and oil had crowded out other sectors, accounting for more than 90% of the country's exports. By the 1930s, 3 foreign companies, Gulf Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, and Standard Oil, controlled 98% of Venezuela's oil market. Gómez's successors sought to reform the oil sector by injecting funds into the government's coffers. The Hydrocarbons Law of 1943 was a step in this direction, requiring foreign companies to pay half of their oil profits to the state. Within 5 years, the government's revenue had increased 6-fold. In 1958, after a series of military dictatorships, Venezuela elected its first stable democratic government. That year, the country's 3 major political parties signed the Punto Fijo Agreement, which guaranteed that state jobs, particularly oil rents, would be distributed among the 3 parties according to the election results. While the agreement aimed to prevent dictatorship and bring about democratic stability, it also ensured that oil profits would remain concentrated in the hands of the state. OPEC in 1960, Venezuela, alongside Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, became one of the founding members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. Over time, the organization expanded to include Qatar, Indonesia, Libya, the United Arab Emirates, Algeria, Nigeria, Ecuador, Gabon, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, and the Republic of the Congo. OPEC coordinated oil prices and granted member countries greater control over their industries. That same year, Venezuela established its first state-owned oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA, and raised the corporate tax rate on oil profits to 65%. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, OPEC imposed a 5-month oil embargo on countries supporting Israel, which caused oil prices to quadruple. This made Venezuela the richest country in Latin America in terms of per capita income. Over the next 2 years, this unexpected windfall added $10 billion to the national treasury. However, it also brought rampant corruption and mismanagement. Analysts estimate that between 1972 and 1997 alone, the amount of money lost to corruption reached $100 billion. In 1976, during the oil boom, President Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized the oil industry and created the state-run company Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA, to oversee all oil exploration, production, refining and exports. Pérez allowed PDVSA to cooperate with foreign oil companies, as long as the companies held a 60% stake in joint ventures. Most importantly, he structured the company to operate with minimal government oversight. By the 1980s, global oil prices collapsed, leading to an economic contraction in Venezuela and a surge in inflation. At the same time, the country accumulated massive foreign debt through acquisitions, such as the purchase of the U.S. company Citgo. In 1989, Pérez, who had been re-elected months earlier, implemented an austerity program as part of an International Monetary Fund, IMF, bailout. These measures triggered deadly riots. In 1992, military officer Hugo Chávez led a failed coup attempt, gaining national attention. Chávez was elected president in 1998 with a socialist platform, promising to use Venezuela's vast oil wealth to reduce poverty and inequality. While his expensive Bolivarian mission expanded social services and reduced poverty by 20%, he also implemented measures that led to a long-term decline in the country's oil production, which peaked in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Chávez decided to dismiss thousands of experienced PDVSA workers who participated in the 2002-2003 industry strike, causing the company to lose crucial technical expertise. Starting in 2005, Chávez began providing subsidized oil to several countries in the Caribbean region through the Petro-Caribe alliance, including Cuba. Chávez continued as president until his death in 2013. Under his leadership, strategic oil reserves steadily declined, and government debt more than doubled. Chávez also used his popularity among the working class to expand presidential power, steering the country toward authoritarianism. He eliminated term limits, effectively took control of the Supreme Court, harassed and shut down independent media, and nationalized hundreds of private enterprises, as well as foreign assets, such as oil projects operated by ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. These reforms paved the way for Nicolás Maduro to establish a dictatorial regime after Chávez's death. Fall into dictatorship. In 2014, global oil prices plummeted, causing Venezuela's economy to rapidly decline. As social unrest brewed, Nicolás Maduro consolidated his power through political repression, censorship, and election manipulation. In 2018, he won re-election in a race widely condemned as unfair and undemocratic. Nearly 60 countries, including the United States, recognized Juan Guaidó, the opposition leader and president of the National Assembly, as the interim leader of Venezuela. Since 2014, this South American country has suffered an astonishing collapse. During the Great Depression, Venezuela's GDP contraction outpaced that of the United States. Many of its nearly 32 million residents could no longer afford food, and hospitals suffering from severe shortages were unable to provide even basic items like soap and antibiotics. Meanwhile, Venezuela's political system descended into chaos. In 2018, President Maduro's re-election was tainted by allegations of election violations and voter intimidation. He faced massive street protests and survived a military uprising in 2019 that was incited by opposition leader Juan Guaidó. Guaidó, who was the elected leader of the National Assembly, had his legislative powers stripped by the Maduro regime. Why did Venezuela deteriorate so rapidly? Scholars researching the country say that its rise and fall were the result of multiple contributing factors. Venezuela has long depended on oil revenues, and Hugo Chávez's Bolivarian revolution didn't fundamentally change this reality, explains Jo Mary Burt, Associate Professor of Political Science and Latin American Studies at the School of Public and International Affairs, University of Georgia. The fall in oil prices, the massive social spending by the Chávez and Maduro governments, U.S. sanctions, economic mismanagement, and high-level corruption all contributed to the economic collapse. Key economic moments in Venezuela's history. 1958. Venezuela elects President Rómulo Betancourt. After the brutal and corrupt dictatorship of Marcos Pérez Jiménez was overthrown, Venezuela's three major political parties agreed to the Punto Fijo Agreement, which accepted the results of a democratic election. The opposition leader, Rómulo Betancourt, widely considered the father of Venezuelan democracy, was elected president. However, as anthropologist Iselin Åsödotter Stronen wrote, this power-sharing agreement also helped establish a system that ensured each party had a stake in government departments, jobs and contracts, while oil revenues remained under state control. 1973, OPEC oil embargo brings billions in revenue. The OPEC oil embargo, which targeted countries like the United States, led to a quadrupling of oil prices, and Venezuela became one of the biggest beneficiaries. As billions of dollars flowed into the national treasury, Venezuela's per capita GDP soared over the next decade. 2 years later, President Carlos Andrés Pérez signed a law nationalizing the oil industry, creating PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, S.A., a state-owned oil company, and forcing foreign companies to give the Venezuelan government 60% ownership of their oil projects. 1989, IMF bailout. In the late 1980s, an oil supply glut caused oil prices to plummet, putting President Pérez's government under intense pressure from a $33 billion foreign debt. Venezuela was forced to accept an IMF bailout and implement austerity measures, which led to sharp increases in the prices of consumer goods and public transport. Protesters took to the streets, and the protests quickly escalated into violence, leading to nationwide curfews and a suspension of civil liberties. 1998. Hugo Chávez. Elected populist leader. Hugo Chávez, a former army colonel who had led a failed coup 6 years earlier, was elected president, overthrowing the political establishment that had controlled the country for decades. Over the next 15 years, Chávez embarked on a massive social spending spree. To fund education, healthcare, food and housing projects for over 30 million people, the government redirected oil profits to address pressing social inequality, explains Tink Salas. While social programs in the Chávez era significantly reduced poverty, they also increased dependence on oil exports. Despite Chávez's desire to diversify Venezuela's economy, his expensive policies only deepened the country's reliance on oil exports. Chávez also worked to expand Venezuela's influence by providing subsidized oil to Cuba in exchange for Cuban doctors and teachers. He sold oil at below-market prices to other South American countries and China. However, Chávez neglected to invest in maintaining oil infrastructure, leading to a decline in oil production. 2013, Nicolás Maduro faces opposition leaders' challenge. After Hugo Chávez passed away from cancer, his carefully chosen successor, Nicolás Maduro, took over the presidency. Maduro won the election by a narrow margin of just 1.6 percentage points, defeating opposition candidate Enrique Capriles, who sought a recount but was unsuccessful. Maduro quickly began consolidating his power, using the authority granted by the National Assembly to rule by decree. However, he was unable to prevent the sharp decline in oil prices, which heavily impacted Venezuela's economy. As Venezuela's situation worsened, the Maduro regime arrested opposition leaders, closed news websites, and detained journalists, drawing criticism from the United Nations and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. In 2017, the Supreme Court, filled with Maduro loyalists, stripped the National Assembly of its powers, further solidifying Maduro's control. The following year, he was re-elected in a widely criticized election, with other nations in the Western Hemisphere condemning the vote as illegitimate. U.S. sanctions and international support. For nearly 2 decades, Washington imposed comprehensive sanctions on Caracas, the most severe of which were aimed at preventing Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, from exporting oil and blocking the government from accessing the U.S. financial system. Despite these sanctions, Venezuela retained oil trading partners, and analysts noted that support from countries like China, Cuba, Iran, Russia and Turkey helped sustain Maduro's regime. 2021. Maduro takes full control of the National Assembly. In January 2021, Maduro and his allies won legislative elections and took control of the last remaining power center held by the opposition, the National Assembly. Opposition figures, including Juan Guaidó, boycotted the vote, claiming it was fraudulent. The Biden administration and other foreign governments and international bodies, including Canada, the European Union, and the Organization of American States, echoed these accusations. However, the November 2021 regional elections further solidified Maduro's power, as the divided opposition won only 3 of the 23 governorships. After years of declining support, the opposition voted to oust Guaidó and dissolve his interim government in December 2022. A thaw in U.S.-Venezuela relations. Meanwhile, U.S.-Venezuela relations showed signs of thawing. In November 2022, the U.S. allowed Chevron, an American oil giant, to resume limited operations in Venezuela, partly to offset the global energy price hikes caused by the Ukraine war. In exchange, the Maduro government and the opposition agreed to resume dialogue after a year-long deadlock. In October 2023, Caracas agreed to a roadmap for free and fair presidential elections in 2024. In response, Washington further eased sanctions on Venezuela's oil and gas sector, allowing it to export oil and gas products within 6 months. However, the thaw faces risks. Ensuring fair elections and addressing Venezuela's ongoing territorial dispute with Guyana over the oil-rich Essequibo region could challenge the fragile process. The situation in Venezuela today remains dire, with the country grappling with extreme economic hardship. External media reports from local interviews revealed just how severe the crisis has become. For example, the price of milk has surged to $3 to $4 USD, and a liter of cooking oil costs around $4 USD, roughly equivalent to the minimum monthly salary of a government employee. This stark inflation and soaring cost of living have transformed basic goods into luxury items for many. As a result, the economic collapse has led to 2 main outcomes: poverty for those who remain and mass migration for those who can escape. According to various national data, approximately 7.7 million Venezuelans have fled the country, representing about a quarter of the population. Over 6.5 million of them now live in Latin American and Caribbean countries. However, many still face immense challenges in leaving, especially those who are trapped by financial constraints. One nurse interviewed shared how many of her colleagues had left because their salaries were not enough to survive. She herself had considered leaving, but stayed behind due to her concern for her family. Instead, she had to take on extra jobs, such as selling vegetables and milk on the streets to make ends meet. Another interviewee, a hotel owner, revealed that he could no longer survive on a single income. He sold his truck, bought land, and began raising sheep for sale and rabbits for his family's consumption, explaining that raising rabbits was more cost-effective than raising chickens. The plight of pensioners is particularly alarming. The national pension pays only $4 USD per month, making it impossible for elderly citizens to retire with dignity. A 75-year-old interviewee expressed that he could not afford to stop working. His pension barely covered basic household expenses, and he lamented that he could no longer afford any leisure activities. Vacations, once a regular part of his life, were now a distant dream. The situation in Venezuela is an alarming example of how political and economic instability, combined with mismanagement and corruption, can lead to the collapse of a nation's economy. Basic necessities becoming out of reach for the average citizen paints a grim picture of a country that once had the wealth of vast oil reserves but is now struggling with poverty and mass emigration. What's even more concerning is the humanitarian crisis. Elderly citizens and the most vulnerable in society are left with almost nothing, and families are forced to make impossible choices just to survive. This cycle of poverty and migration puts tremendous pressure on neighboring countries, which already face their own challenges. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan government continues to exert control, which only further isolates the country from international support. This situation highlights the urgent need for change, both in terms of governance and economic restructuring, to allow the people of Venezuela to rebuild their lives. The focus now should be on improving the livelihoods of those who remain behind, offering support to migrants who are trying to rebuild their lives in foreign lands, and providing the international community with a framework for helping Venezuela escape this crisis. If you have thoughts or opinions on how this crisis can be addressed, feel free to share in the comments.